Well, hello, everyone. It's John Byrne with Poets and Quants. We have a third session with experts from Admissionado, the admissions consulting firm. The title of our webinar today is luckily we can edit all this stuff. Isn't that really? The title of our webinar today is Crushing Your R2 Applications. Of course, R2 refers to round two. And before you know it, those deadlines are going to crush you. And we're going to get wisdom from seasoned pros. And let me introduce you to our two pros. Alex Min had been the CEO of the MBA Exchange, MIT MBA, someone I've known for a number of years, who I know you're going to greatly appreciate. And John Miles, also a longtime consultant with Admissionado, who in fact is a big music lover. I loved in your bio, John, that you say you attended over 400 concerts.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's and counting now that we're post-pandemic, more or less. So,
what was your most memorable concert ever?
Would probably be at 18 years old. I held up a sign in New Jersey and sang a song with Sting. He brought me on stage and sang kind of a country sounding song called I'm So Happy I Can't Stop Crying, which was about divorce, but at 18, I was still up there. So.
I happen to know that song well because I'm a big Sting fan. In fact, my wife and I saw Sting only a month ago.
Okay.
Love it. In Vienna, Virginia.
Wolf Trap, I was about to say, yep. Excellent.
And for trading best shows ever, I'm going to tell you the best show I ever saw was the Allman Brothers Band closing the Fillmore East.
Wow. Wow.
And the beauty of that is I remember going to the 11:30 show, and when we left the theater, the sun had risen.
Love it.
All right. We're not here to talk music or bands or anything else. We're here to talk about how you can crush your R2 application. So let's talk a little bit about the basics, okay? What do you need to know? How do you need to approach this in terms of your mindset to basically do a really successful application? Everyone knows round two is the crowded round, right? It's when most people, in fact, apply to the most highly selected programs. So, Alex, you want to lead us off? What's your general advice? How do you approach this with your mind and your emotions? Let's get to that part of it.
I love this question. And the first thing I say is forget about it. And I know that sounds weird, but it's like demographics too. I'm of this demographic. Does it help me here? It's great to know how you're stacked up against your fellow applicants. But in the end, if round one's already gone by, it's already gone by. So the relevant question is, are you applying or not? If you're not, it's a moot question. But if you're applying, that's what you got. So you're applying for round two anyway. So get over it. Then let's talk about just applying, period. So that's the first thing I like to say, is that, hey, round one's already over, so it's a kind of a moot question. And we know people get accepted in round two. Some schools, it's half and half, actually. So regardless of how many applicants are applying, people get accepted. And so let's talk about how I try to shift the conversation. Actually, let's not even talk about round two. And let's just talk about how we can maximize your chances of getting in by telling your story well.
I like that. Be in the moment, in other words.
Yeah, and it's a moot point, right? So you can't make round one come back again anyway.
Yes, absolutely. John, you have a
and as a former round two applicant, and I didn't get in the first year I applied, and we'll talk about that later in the session, but I think of this period too as kind of distraction time. We've got holidays in various countries. You have people on vacations. This is the kind of time where you have to start early and look at the elements and components of the application and start to think about, okay, who do I need to reach out to? And that could also mean webinars, info sessions, as I kind of call it, the intangibles, the alums, the students, your sphere of influence in terms of family member or friends and family that may have gone, because people's schedules just kind of they're not going to focus on this per se. So I'd be sure to think about but starting early. And also, the psychology of it for me, especially back then, was And we'll get to this too in a little more detail, but you obviously want to apply in the round that you're best prepared for. And what happens in round two is you get some people, or round one people too, that just weren't ready for that, and they have to reapply. And what ends up happening, or do other schools, is they rush their applications in that final December kind of rush, which puts you at an advantage of starting early and interacting with admissions and or any other opportunities around this distraction time.
Yeah, if I may add to what John just mentioned, earlier my statement was slightly flippant, but on purpose. If we're having this conversation in July, it'd be a different conversation. Do I do round one or round two?
Yeah.
But like John, believe it or not, the first time I applied, I actually didn't get in anywhere. I got waitlisted at Stanford, didn't get off the wait pool, as they call it. So I applied 5 years later. So I'm a reapplicant myself, and I split my applications half and half between round one and round two. We can talk about why I did that, but that's less relevant. What I wanted to really say is, like John mentioned, the great thing about round two is for round one, unless you're really a forward thinker and went to school visits in the spring, you may have not visited any campuses at all before you submitted your application. With round two, you have this entire fall golden opportunity to go actually visit the schools that you're applying to. Only if you do what John said, though, and using that time wisely between now and January.
Yeah, very true. And John, what was your reapplication story?
So I applied to 4 schools round two, 3 of the M7s, one of which my manager recommender had attended, and my father, and did not get in. And there's a big reason why, and it has to do with no goals and really weak essays, and we'll talk about that later. I did get waitlisted by I guess the lowest ranked school in that pool. So waitlisted for 7 to 8 months. I actually learned I did not get in a week before orientation. I reapplied in round one just to that school, just to Duke, and I got in. I will get into it more, but the value of the intangibles of talking to people for those 7 or 8 months, I can't begin to talk about how many people answered my emails. Alums wrote emails for me. I went down to campus multiple times, but that's an important thing to be thinking of, because as Alex said, in the summer months, there really aren't students around, so a lot of people won't visit. But then you visit now, you get to really interact with people who then can kind of put a word in for you. Yeah,
so true. And now that the pandemic, while it's lingering, has been diminished, it really is a good time to go and visit a campus. And I'm sure that both of you would recommend that, and just in terms of aligning fit, feeling comfortable, you really should go and visit a campus if you really intend to go there, right?
Yeah, I want to add too, John, to one point, a lot of folks who are applying to the top programs, and I mean the top 20, globally, let's say, they know you're kind of throwing darts to see what sticks in some ways. I mean, sure, you might be wedded and really want to go to certain programs, but the value of, I use this word all the time, of showing authenticity, of showing that you genuinely really want to go to Sloan or to Tuck, that you'd be amazed at how many people just don't have the time to kind of go to that extra level of depth. And they're just all about the breadth and seeing where they'll get an interview. As soon as you show that level, it changes the temperature, I feel like, in the admissions eyes.
Great. Now let's talk a little bit about just big picture R2 strategy. Alex, your recommendations.
Yep, we already talked about it, but go visit the schools that you're interested in. And there's multiple reasons for that. One is, like John mentioned, finding whether it's a good fit for you. On the applying side, tactically, and this was something that my admissions, so full disclosure, I'm actually a former client of the MBA Exchange, my second time applying. First time I did it on my own, and it was complete amateur night in hindsight. But one of the, I never visited any campuses. One of the things my admissions consultant said is, I really highly recommend you go visit the schools that you are really serious about if you can. So I did. I visited 8 schools. And I was older, so I was an older applicant, and I had already failed one, so I didn't have much confidence. I went overboard. But in visiting the schools, and this was some of the strategies and tactics that my consultant mentioned to me, is don't just do the day that the school gives you, meaning the campus visit, having lunch, classroom visit. These are all typical of campus visits for most top tier schools. But I said, go find some students and just talk with them. Hang out later on campus and see what they do socially, and see if they'll let most people, they're very accepting, most campuses, see if you can go to a social thing. So I did all those things. And what it did is it really, on a tactical level, it helped me personalize my application and essays for that school and telling them why I appreciated that particular school. But it solidified for me in that process of authenticity is a great word, what specifically at the school I would take advantage of and what I would be able to contribute to the school. I wouldn't have been able to articulate that without those interactions of having visited the campus and having had those talks with students and even a professor.
Yeah, that's a really good point. In fact, Alex, I wonder what other advice you got that changed the way you applied in your second time around that got you admitted.
Oh my gosh.
Key points that you recall?
Oh my God. Yes, I could go on for hours on that. I'm sure John could as well. I'll try to I'll try to be succinct and try the big ones where. So I thought I had personalized my first time around. I had personalized my essays to the why school X question, why that school was a good fit for me, as well as articulating what I'd been doing. And I was in the Marines at the time when I applied my first time. And I thought I had a really strong candidacy. I had a 750 GMAT, 99 percentile, quant, and this was, mind you, in 1999, dating myself, before all the escalation with test scores.
Yes.
My GPA wasn't the highest, but it was a solid 3.5, and it was coming from MIT, so it wasn't too shabby. And I had seen combat. I mean, pardon my language here for a second. I thought I was shit hot, and I was getting a recommendation from a 3-star general.
Alex,
who had 50
you were hot.
Well, yes, but we're getting to the relevant point to your question. My main recommender was a 3-star general who had 50,000 people reporting to him, and I reported to him directly. He treated me like a son. So here's where I failed, that I realized later working with my admissions consultant. I never told my story well. I never clearly articulated all the things I had done in the past, how that kind of was the bridgeway for what I want to do in the future after getting my MBA, and why business school was the stepping stone for me to get from A to B. I thought I had done all those things. One of the first things my consultant said after reading through my former essays was, wow, Alex, you sound like every other military pilot who wants to use business school to transition to a civilian career. Where's the differentiation? Where's the specificity to you and that school? So that was one of the biggest lessons I learned. I thought I had done all those things, but he had the advantage of having read thousands of applications, if not tens of thousands.
Yes.
And so that was something that I learned very quickly. The other thing was, you two are going to laugh being professionals in this industry. I had a really scientific way of picking my schools of applying to. I went down US News and World Report, and John, I know how you feel about rankings, love and hate, but I went down the top 5, and that's what I did. Whereas my consultant really made me dig deep on, well, why is school X a good fit for you? It made me articulate that. So the second time around, I was much more thoughtful of the schools that I applied to.
I love that story, because you're also making the case for why a consultant can be a really valuable aid in navigating what can be a pretty complicated, grueling process, applying to a highly selective business school. Now, John, I imagine that your case was a bit easier because you got on the wait list, and then you kind of self-selected into the school that put you on the wait list. So even though you didn't get off the wait list the first time, when you came around the second time, they kind of knew you.
Yeah, and it was interesting because it was with the year that Fuqua had the highest number of yeses. So the yield, they almost couldn't fill that. The wait, they hardly even looked at the wait. They just couldn't. They didn't have the space. It was the record number of that class. That, and with me, it was interesting because I did not use a consultant either, like Alex. Now I had a 610, and that was after 3 attempts. But I was a vice president at an investment bank. I was 30 years old. That was a bit of an enigma to them in the sense of, why does he need to go back right now? Which led to my essays, which were these idealistic sort of save the world type of things. There was no mention of going to get a job at any point. It was more just me going off on certain things in the world that I think are wrong in terms of healthcare, for that matter. What happened in those 7 months, and when I reapplied, I really doubled down on sort of the love for Duke, having gone there as an undergrad. And I kind of pitched, look, I know I'm a little older, but I'm going to be valuable to your class given some of the experiences I've had. that ultimately led to when I graduated and being the student speaker at the Fuqua graduation. So I always joke that I was probably the guy in the arena with the lowest score, but I got to speak to the class because those were my strengths. My strengths were not in other facets of the application process, but they were in sort of bringing together that Team Fuqua thing. The Team Fuqua and the spirit of authenticity, that's what I think they saw in me. And that's why I always harp on people who are applying to certain schools like a Tuck or like a Booth. You've got to get into the DNA of that culture. Yeah.
Yeah, really true. Let's get into now the basics of an MBA application from kind of start to finish: resumes, essays, letter recommendations, work experience, the interview, and of course your short and long-term goals, to the extent that you tell admissions what your real goal is, because sometimes your real goal you may not want to put in, but we'll get to that. Let's just talk about, how does a business school application resume differ from a more typical work resume?
Yeah, I guess I'll start off. So I would say, John, one of the things that jumps out to me when we first get the resume from someone on maybe a consultation, or when we first kick off our strategy sessions, the bullet points often don't have much context to them. So it'll be something like, promoted within my first 2 years, and then our thoughts are based on what, and then why is that the first bullet? That really should be the bottom, because we want to talk about in the first bullet your main primary responsibilities, leading with a strong action verb. We use the phrase impact-oriented bullets. So we like to see some result at the end. So the idea is that you led some cross-cultural team consisting of how many people through a supply chain project, which led to something. Now, the tricky thing with an MBA versus the job one, I find, is people feel like, well, I don't have results. I don't have quantitative stuff. We hear this all the time. Impact and results don't necessarily have to have a number, a revenue number, or a cost savings at the end. They could have a reviewed by the investment committee or presented to the board quarterly, something that puts you in stature, because then they say, well, you want to go to BCG or McKinsey. Well, you've had executive level interaction. We see that right there. So I think for me, when I first see the job searches can be more technical. And I've worked with a lot of technical PhD, a nanotech PhD from Taiwan, for example, who works on the smartphones we were using every day. That was equipped for any job in the world to fit his position, but we really had to convert it, and particularly if this is for Oxford, the MBA program, we had to really convert it into what did he lead a team in the lab? Did he mentor people? That's the other big thing.
Yeah, because people want to see either leadership skills or the potential to be a great leader in that resume, the essays, and in the application overall. Alex, your sense of how to create a perfect resume for a business school application?
Yes, and before I answer that question, the resume is a tactical item among all the components of the application. Before we start talking about tactical components, what I'd like to tell clients, and this is the MBA Exchange kind of philosophy, and a third of our staff are former admissions officers, so we know this to be true. What we tell clients is, the admissions office does not look at the resume as a resume, your letters of recommendation as letters of recommendation, and your essays as your essays. They look at your entire application package holistically to tell, what is the story you're telling me about yourself? So that's the first thing. We want to get away from this tactical, myopic, narrow look of each component in as separate items. We take the approach of the entire application together tells your story. And so what's in your application, what's in your resume? Now we can get tactical.
And to that point, right, it should all line up neatly, but not be redundant.
Yes. Exactly. We call it real estate. You want some overlap here and there, but you don't want repeated things because you just wasted real estate. And a key example is what your letter of your recommender says about you, and talking about a time that you are really wonderful at work. Well, that probably should be in your resume somewhere.
Yeah.
Whatever it was that you did. It doesn't have to be, but it could be. And the resume is just a bullet point, like John mentioned, but then the recommender brings it to life. That's just one example of a holistic approach of having your application tell your story together. So, but you did ask me a very specific question. So I don't want to get into too much because that would be giving away some of the things we save for our paid clients. But adcoms look for admissions committee, adcoms look for very specific things in a resume. And so we know what those are. So we want those to be there. But I don't want to be coy. There is one thing that John mentioned that I agree. What the question you had asked, John, was what's the difference between a professional resume and perhaps a resume that you would use for business school applications? So one of them is, I don't agree with this, but in HR, there's two schools of thought. In a professional resume, there should be nothing personal. Whether you like fly fishing or not, it shouldn't be there. It should be about your job qualifications and things like that. That's one school of thought. Another school of thought is you could have personal things. Regardless, for a business school resume, you should have personal things. And I say that I'm rarely black and white because most things in admissions, in my opinion, are it depends. But when it comes to your resume for business school applications, not at the top, but at the bottom, you should have personal things. Because unlike a company trying to hire you to find someone that's going to do a job, business schools want people that are going to be already leaders and future leaders, like we talked about already, but also they want interesting people. Because they're putting a cohort together of very interesting people. They're going to feed off of each other and create that wonderful class. So personal things alone won't get you in, but they do matter.
And I would think, just turning to essays now, that a personalized approach is ideal because you want to be authentic, genuine, and you want to be remembered. What's your general advice for creating a terrific essay? John?
Yeah, and Admissionado, the essays are for us a big focal point in how we structure them. And it all starts not even looking at the essays. It starts with learning about you and who you are and where you've been. And there's a lot that goes into that, whether it's resilience moments, trauma moments, shaping incidents that fueled your goals. There's that big funnel, and we just start with everything and then start to see, okay, what's going to resonate, and also what's going to resonate based on the school and what they're looking for, because you'll get people that have never really worked on teams that want to go to a very team-oriented program. We have to shift which story we're going to use. We look at the essays also in totality. This goes to, John, your point about all the application components. But so many people will often start with, well, I'm going to send you the first essay for review, and then I'll send you the second. And we're always saying, no, we want to review them together because there's the risk of contradictions, thematic inconsistencies, and also where do those LORs, what are they saying in the LORs? If they're saying your constructive feedback question talks about your lack of teamwork, and then in your essays, you're going on about what a great team player you are, there's an inconsistency. So when we're looking at the essays, we're looking for some corroboration in terms of the LO and the letters of recommendation in particular. The other thing with the essays is, of course, with the word count. I was a literature major, English major, so I've written a lot, and there was this tendency when I applied to write these beautifully sounding, kind of dramatic and scene-like, cinematography-like essays. There's no time for that. There's no room for that, gang. I mean, so I'm reviewing one this morning, which says, it was a cold day on West 43rd Street. And my first comment is, with 500 words, we can't talk about the weather. We got to get, so really it's just keep these lean and keep them answer the question. And lastly, I find with essays, you can take the same story and make it malleable and look at it from different angles. So your best challenge story might also be your best leadership story. So don't be afraid to sort of review and have a different aperture on an essay in the same story, but just in a different way of presentation.
Well, it's liberating to know you don't have to write as if you're writing for the New Yorker
right.
essays pages. And it's also liberating to know, use every word. Don't waste words and make people go through a forest to find you.
Yeah.
Alex, your general advice on essays and crafting?
I agree with both of you. So true. It just reminded me of something funny. American author once said, "Sir, my apologies. Had I more time, I would have written you a shorter letter."
Yes.
It's Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens said that.
Exactly.
Yes, I love telling that. But getting to the pertinent question at hand, it's the same thing that John already said, but perhaps in different words. So we always say, generally, specific and details are better than general and vague. Word count is one of the issues, but that aside, whatever you wrote, the more specific and more details you can give and telling a story as opposed to listing a bunch of things. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes I see is people try to cram so much, whether it's 250 words or 500 words or 1,000 words that you have. It's just trying to cram in too much.
Yeah.
It's telling 5 stories very shallowly is much less better than saying 1 or 2 stories deeper. That's what we generally believe. I mean, there's always exceptions, but, and you know, not to shout out to Poets and Quants, John, but something I love about Poets and Quants, not only all the reporting, but any piece of writing that you guys send out is specific. And if there's something that information you guys couldn't get, you tell that to the audience. And that's why I love reading the article. Every day I read the daily digest from Poets and Quants, and don't have time to read everything, but pick the articles I read. And that's a lot of our clients know about Poets and Quants as a resource. They see how they write in Poets and Quants. Keep that in mind too as we develop our essays.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, clarity,
Clarity,
direct, no wasted time or words, very important. How do you leverage your work experience in the application? Alex, do you do that in the essays? Do you do that in the short questions that are there? Do you do it both? What's your general advice?
So I always tell clients that 95% of the questions you ask me as an admissions consultant, without even having heard the question, I can start answering with 2 words. And those 2 words are, it depends.
Right.
So, and I tell our son and daughter too, in life, generally, a lot of times things aren't binary. So that is a definitely it depends question, I think. Again, looking at the application holistically, if your recommenders are great enough that they worked with you, they wrote it, but they worked with you on what to say, and they talked a lot about your professional accomplishments, then maybe you, in your essays, you can afford not to talk, and your resume is going to have a lot of your professional accomplishments. Maybe that's enough. And in your essays, you can talk more about your personal motivations, why I did something, why I did a career jump, why I left a very safe job at McKinsey to do something else in industry, just as an example, one of many. So I would say that it's definitely it depends question. Having said that, it has to show somewhere for sure. Your resume is what I call your teaser. The AdCom starts seeing what your professional life is and what your achievements professionally might have been. Then between your essay and letters of recommendation and the short answer questions are the places that I would leverage your work experience. But it's very important to remember that it's not just your work experience that's going to get you in.
Right.
Yep.
John, I assume you agree with that.
I do, and I think I'll add, I sort of a few years ago started to think about the question of, well, of all the essay questions that could be asked, any questions, why are certain schools asking these? Why are some are asking those? And I started to kind of think that, well, perhaps there's a big signaling going on here in the sense that what a school is looking for in some ways is largely based on, and this might sound, well, that's obvious, but I think people get so used to seeing, well, here, I got to write this and I'm going to answer the essay goals. But some schools don't really focus on the goals. Some schools focus more on your international experience or ethical dilemma, the more of the personal traits. So I really think about when you're approaching each application to think about, well, what are they maybe telling me that they'd like to get from me from a more general sense. And I think that is proven for some of my clients, proven well, where I've had people who, let's just say are they're younger, they don't have as much work experience, they're not 30 years old, or they were non-traditional, they were Olympic athletes, they were special forces or operators, that kind of thing, where a lot of leadership, but a lot of, heavy, and Alex would know this, heavy military stuff that they didn't know how to translate that into how is it going to make sense on campus at Kellogg,
Right. Okay, letters of recommendation. Now, I've had the privilege of sitting in as a fly on the wall to several admission committee meetings at which I was shocked by some of the letters of references that came in. Obviously, you're going to pick someone who's going to be incredibly positive, but you would be surprised at what even a positive recommendation can do, because they may say, oh, I wish this or I wish that, or they may say something that doesn't align with something the candidate said in the essays and the short answers. It's just a mismatch. So what's your general advice on, number one, how to choose a recommender, and then how to guide that recommender to get the best possible letter from him or her? Alex?
Yeah, we have a whole module on this topic alone, how to pick recommenders and then how to work with them. We have a soft algorithm, if you will, on criteria that make a good recommender. Probably one of the highest criteria, no matter how the soft algorithm plays out, is they really need to know you well. I think that's the number one thing. I'm president so-and-so, but I only know the applicant like once a year. I see him at a whatever, or her. That's not helpful. So someone that knows you well over someone who's maybe senior in the organization. If they know you well and they happen to be senior, even better. If they happen to have an MBA, even better. But these are all soft algorithms. What's more important depends on the situation. But one of the things that we talk about is, are they willing to have a conversation with you on what to write? And I think that's very, very important. I didn't have that my first time. I have no, and recommenders are always the big wild card. You can craft what you think is a great application, but you can't control your recommenders. And so that's always the big wild card. And when we do ding analysis, oftentimes we'll say, well, we don't know what your recommender said. So that could be part of, why you got dinged. But like Journal Knudsen, who was my main recommender I mentioned earlier, I have no idea what he said. I will never know what he said. I'm assuming they're good things. But how he said them and what he talked about, I don't know. So if you have a recommender that's willing to sit down with you and kind of discuss, hey, what should I talk about you? And especially the question that we all kind of hate, but I love, is that, what could they improve on? That's also a great question to talk through with your recommender, and that answer aligns with whatever you're portraying with the rest of your application. So those are some of the criteria I would.
And what if a recommender says, why don't you write me a draft?
Yeah, we hate that because, human beings are incredibly perceptive. And I think one of the quickest ways you can get a ding is if an AdCom thinks that you wrote the letter of recommendation, that's probably a very quick ding. And also the recommender's voice doesn't come out. And for international clients that we have, they worry about grammar and typos. We say, no, if they know their recommender's English isn't their native language, there better be some typos and some grammatical mistakes, unless they're, educated in an English speaking country.
Right.
So getting back to your original question, we don't like that. But believe it or not, in the military, believe it or not, and other constituencies as well, where they could ask you to write in the military, when we do our annual performance reviews, different services call it, in the Marines, we call it a rep fitness report. The culture is that you write it, the draft, at least the draft, for your boss, and your boss will kind of change a few things and then mark what they want to mark. And that's the culture in the military. So, and I initially used to have a lot of military clients till I kind of got more educated and branched out to all industries and functions. So we say avoid it if you can. If you can't avoid it, because your recommenders are probably very busy people, then give them bullet points, right? So that they can expand upon. Could you talk about a time when I did this, and here are the things to highlight? So that's kind of the compromise, and usually that works. In the worst case, where the recommender says, no, I don't have time, you have to write it for me, then that's a very difficult situation. And we have some tips and tricks on how to get past that. But one of the things you should always ask, even if you end up having to do that, is that, could you please change this into your own words and your own language?
Right. So at the minimum, though, don't you think, like, John, a cheat sheet is helpful? Like, do you remember the time I was on this task force with 5 other global team members and we accomplished blank? Can you talk about that? I mean, is that okay?
Yeah, there the details and sort of equipping your recommenders with sort of the bullet points is a big thing in terms of what stories you'd like them to highlight, because they may not know the culture of UCLA versus Foster versus UNC, and there could be tweaks. If they want to talk about you're such an all-star and you're applying to Fuqua, that's not a great idea. So I think that there has to be some level of educating them if they don't know. And I would add one thing, which is, and this comes up a lot, and there's a big spectrum between really, really good letters of recommendations and poor. There's really not, but you either nail it or you don't. And one of the things is I constantly see is the cliches. They work hard, they're diligent, they get to work early. Everyone applying to all these schools does that. you're competing against, it's kind of the all-stars of the all-stars here. So you really want to focus on the non-cliche things. And I would say to recommenders, find an angle. So for me, I used a compliance officer in 2008 as one of my recommenders. In 2007, for the first time I applied. And at that point, especially in financial services, there was a lot of stuff in the newspaper with WorldCom, of course, in 03. And there's something about the compliance angle. And I had such a good relationship with her, with the compliance officer. And so I'd say try to look for something like that. I mean, you're going to get the leadership, the teamwork stories. I think mentoring stories are really, really strong, where you've taken someone under your wing, but the people stories. But be careful to just kind of, he works hard, and they're really attention to detail. Everyone is applying to these schools. Everyone is.
Absolutely.
May I tell a quick story?
Yeah,
to build
please
on that?
do.
So this is an actual client. I won't name her, obviously, but her recommender, she asked her recommender to say something about, how nice she is. And the client was actually a really nice person because she was applying to Tuck, and Tuck looks for that specifically.
Yeah.
So the
Right. They
recommender
had an
was,
admissions director who actually went out and said, "We want nice people."
Yep.
right. But they define nice, right? Which I love about Tuck. And so her recommender actually shared the recommendation after she submitted it with the client, and the client shared it with me. And so I got to see it. And one of the things that the recommender wrote about, among many glowing things, was the fact that she would bring coffee to her teammates, even though she was the senior person.
Yeah.
Because she saw that every morning because it was long circumstances, but the fact is they had to come into work and they didn't have time to get coffee. And so she would actually bring in coffee for them. Just one of many, sprinkled about 3 or 4 examples by telling stories that were very specific.
Wow, really.
John, and just, sorry, I have to add, it's a great point. And it reminds me of the difference with essays and letters of recommendation sometimes is you can't get as much visual sometimes in some essays because of some word limits. But gosh, some of these recommendation letters are quite long, or can be, with that, some don't have word limits. The visual, and it's like cinematography. You have that foreground and background shot. And I'm always trying to say, gosh, take that adcom into that foreground. And I have a client who's interviewing right now who a similar thing to yours who would go around and just, he found out that the engineers love to play chess. So kind of towards the end of the day, he brought a chessboard in because, again, he was in more of a biz dev role. Total bonding over that. It was great. So,
okay, short-term, long-term goals. Obviously, sometimes people have unrealistic expectations about where the MBA can bring them. I mean, if I am in product management, never been in finance, and suddenly I tell people I want to go into PE, hedge funds, or venture capital, that could be a big red flag to an admissions officer. So what should you say? And how should you form your short and long-term goals on an application?
If I may go, I want to use that as an example because I actually had a client, this was years and years ago. She was a baker and she wanted to become an investment banker. And she wanted to say that in her application. And at first, this was before I got to know her, I was like, whoa, that's kind of a big stretch. But as we got to know each other more and we have some tools to really dig into this long-term, short-term goal, found out she wasn't just a baker, she owned a bakery. And then she opened 2 more stores. This was, well, I shouldn't give the city, a major city in the United States. And in the process of opening those stores, she had to get a valuation of her initial company. She was very good at math from a very early age and had always been good at math. But that process of getting evaluation, and then the labor rates were different for those 2 other stores and their rents were different, and figuring all that, in essence, what she did was a mini small acquisition project, if you will. And once we started teasing that out, and then the monetary values of these 3 stores wasn't chump change, it parlayed into the story of why she wanted to get into investment banking and mergers and acquisitions very specifically. And it started to make sense. And long story short, she still works at Goldman Sachs, as a matter of fact, as an investment banker. So that, I think if it's a far stretch and there's no real bridge, that's going to be much more challenging. But I think our jobs as professional coaches and admissions consultants is really digging deep onto what have you been doing. Is it realistic to talk about your short-term and long-term experiences or what you want to do? If it doesn't make, you alluded to this earlier, John, and I'm a case of this, so I'm not going to say anyone else does this, but I did this. What I actually wrote the second time my applications was something I never really intended to do, because I didn't know what I really wanted to do. I was one of those people that when I got to business school, the day business school started, I really had no idea what I wanted to do after 2 years. And I was going to use business school to figure that out. Apparently that kind of came through the first time I applied, which is a big no. The second time, absolutely, I knew exactly what industry, what function, almost down to which company I wanted to work for. Now, it's not something that I intended to do, but it's something I could have done, if that makes sense. Because if you pick something you have absolutely no interest in, human beings, again, are incredibly perceptive. It'll show. But my consultant worked with me and said, well, he gave me a bunch of ideas after getting to know me and talking to me. Could you do this? Could you do that? And we picked 2 or 3 things that resonated with me, although it's not really what I necessarily wanted to do, but I could see myself doing it. And so we wrote my future long-term and short-term goals based on that. So hopefully that at least helps a little bit.
Yes, and I'll just make one side note here. Bakers get up very early and work long hours, like investment bankers.
That's right. That's right.
We actually talked about that, early mornings. Yeah.
Yeah. John, your take on this?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I worked with a sommelier once who, so we had to take that story and it worked. It was more on a hospitality angle, but there was fine. It's funny because we looked at his customer market segmentation and in terms of marketing and what he had to go through. And I mean, it's fascinating. And then of course, and be able to help people pair wines for their meetings instead of, or golf outings after whatever they're doing. But we kind of, the word that comes up with essays for when I'm looking at the stories is credibility, in terms of, do you have any connective pieces from the past that at least give you some credibility? A lot of people too, I find, successfully have shaping incidents from their youth. A classic example, I had a client who I've worked with a homeless fellow. I've worked with someone who grew up on food stamps, who ended up basically getting into student loan debt, and because of disclosures and not understanding them. So his whole mission in the essays and the applications was, I'm going to go work at a Betterment or a SoFi, and just I want to be a part of changing this stuff. So I've always described it as putting a flag in the ground around something that you just really care about. It could be a healthcare issue. I see a lot of those, of course, all over the world. The death of a loved one at an early age and what that did. Inadequate access to rural healthcare. I'm working with a client right now on that. If you have something that fire, that passion, and not the classic, like I have a passion, for technology. Well, what does that mean? What about technology when you were little really shaped you, or was there a tragedy where in a car accident where technology saved your life? Take them to, again, we're going back to stories. So I try to find those sticking points and then just build off of there.
Yeah, really good. Now, of course, if all this works, you get to go to an interview. And while this is early for round 2 candidates, round 1 candidates are right in the middle of that. They're being interviewed now, or they're getting invites to interview within coming weeks. What's your basic interview advice, John?
Yeah. So I always start with, you want to get into school, but for most schools, you have to get the interview first. So if you approach it with that mind, and this is your time to shine. This is actually, I find, the time to really have fun and sell what you've been working so hard on for months. Very different than a job search interview. And that's one thing that we make very clear, at least at Admissionado, is you're not going to get logic questions, and how many ping pong balls can you fit in an airplane you might get through a consultant or whatnot. These are conversational, behavioral. It's sort of like what we're doing here, just a natural conversation. And a lot of people are thrown off by that because they come in over rehearsed. They want to script everything out. So I'm a big fan of almost like an essay outline. You know your essays, your stories. For Fuqua, let's say, your top 25 neat things about you. Just kind of have a bullet. You know your goals, but if you go in there so over prepared, you're going to come across as too serious. And I've had clients where the interviews haven't gone well with schools that I would call, the personality schools that are looking for the kind of the real complete palette. They're like, John, I felt too serious. I felt like I was rigid. I'm like, that's exactly what I'm talking about here. Is it's got to be more of a kind of bidirectional conversation. And you in some ways, you want to balance some personal and professional, ideally, if that comes out. The walk me through your resume can be one example where you get some of the personal, in there at the end. But generally, that's my advice, is to really keep it relaxed and have fun. This is your time to kind of finally, let loose.
course, it's very easy to freeze up. We all know that the acceptance rates at the kind of schools we're talking about are pretty low. And we also all know that the vast majority of candidates are self-selecting into these applicant pools. And the vast majority are fully qualified to get in and do well. And then you get the interview, and it's pretty much a 50-50 shot or a 60-40 shot, depending on which school you're at. So you don't want to blow it during the interview. Yeah. You're right. I think appearing to be scripted or rehearsed kills you. Yeah. What are other things that can kill you in an interview, Alex?
What could kill you? So I'm getting the kind of harder question here. Well, so this is an actual, this is someone it wasn't a client of ours, but we know this actually happened because one of our former admissions officers told us this story. M7 school, superlative applicant on paper. I mean, amazing applicant on paper. It was a she, that's coincidental. But you know, it was almost one of those cases where if we didn't have the interview, she'd already be in type of kind of background, if you will. She was really rude to the receptionist on the way in and on the way out, and really showed her true colors that she was really arrogant. The interview went really well, actually. But as the interviewer was coming out, the receptionist said, "Hey, did you just interview so-and-so?" You know, she was really rude and mean, not just to me, but everyone here. So that was the reason she didn't get in.
That's a good reason.
Yes.
John, if I could add to Alex brought up an interesting word there, and arrogant, and I'm going to add a word, entitlement. And this kind of looks at the process overall. A lot of folks applying to these top MBA programs globally, you know, you've done well on different facets. It could be as an athlete, it could be as an artist, it could be as a baker, it could be as you know, an investment banking analyst. This is, you're competing with a lot of kind of high octane folks who've done well on very different facets. And you have to approach the interview in the process like that, in a very humble, appreciative way. So I have had folks be like, "Oh, I got another interview today. I got another interview." And it's sort of like, well, that's great. You worked hard on your application, but you can't go in there feeling like it's in the bag or that you're entitled to it. It's that competitive. Right. So I always tell people just to, again, remember who you're competing against and just be very thankful and gracious, and to go back to the Tuck word, nice, when you're in that setting.
Right. Hey, now, John, you are with Admissionado. Alex, you're with MBA Exchange. MBA Exchange helped you get into MIT, and then you ultimately bought and became CEO of MBA Exchange. Do the two firms have different philosophical approaches to admissions, or different frameworks for bringing people through the application process, or is it one and the same? Alex?
I don't know if I can answer that question, John, because I don't know Admissionado. I know the MBA Exchange really well. I was a former client. I've been an admissions consultant with the firm since 2007. And as you mentioned, I was a CEO for half a decade. But I don't know Admissionado, so I can't really answer that question. I can speak for the MBA Exchange in that, as I mentioned earlier, our approach is to look at everything very holistically. It's also to get to know our clients very deeply. And the essays are at our firm, it's one of the last things we work on. We do, what is your resume saying? What are we going to have your recommender say? Everything else, and then what have we not said? What do we still want to say? How do we tie all this together? So we save because you have the most control over the essay, so we do that last. What I do know about Admissionado, and I just met John M, and we've been getting to know each other. I think what we have in common, at a minimum, is this: we really deeply care about our clients. Yeah. And we have a very low ratio of client to consultant ratio, so that we have a chance to really get to know our clients really well. I get the impression that we're also both firms that try to look at everything holistically.
Yeah, and John, it's a great question. And I just start off in terms of MBA Exchange and you know, this tone of caring but very serious about what they do. Sort of struck me immediately as I started interacting with Alex, where in this idea of we're not gonna be transactional. I mean, that's a word that comes up a lot, and I've learned from folks, and it's more like we're there at the first step, and then when we're ready for the next step, we'll go. But it kind of got very heavy on guidance. And you can see it here today in terms of a lot of Alex's comments. Admissionado, it sort of, for me, it was a very good fit, partly because of this idea of getting into giving everyone a chance. So we tend to push you to your potential, whereas, you know, I think there can be a tendency where people will call you up and say, oh, I'm never going to get in there. I love when people say that to me, because I'm sort of like, well, you're a baker, let's figure this out. That to us is the challenge, is finding the story, finding the nuggets. We can't change your past, but our focus is bringing it to really making it resonate in some way. And I love that idea of just sort of getting someone over that hurdle, even though they feel like they have no shot. And that is part caring, and it's part really getting into your life to the extent you want to share it, as Alex said with MBA Exchange as well.
That's great. One last question. So we are recording this in mid-October. We're about 3 months away from those round 2 deadlines that come one after the other, like dominoes crushing down on the table. Is 3 months enough to go from start to finish for round 2, or should people have already begun the process, John?
I do think 3 months is enough, and that would include a visit. I think a lot of it will depend on holiday schedules. I think people have to sacrifice a bit sometimes around these times,
Sure,
in terms of what they
absolutely.
can do.
It's
But
like sacrifice, right?
Right. Yeah, and I tell people I don't take vacation until basically the end of January. I'm around all the time. So yeah, I would say it is doable, but you need to. Some people who are really organized and applying to these schools actually, I have trouble with the timing, the timeline. So I think, I mean, one of the benefits of working with a consultant is keeping you moving. Yeah.
Yeah, Alex, you agree, right? You just got to get on the stick.
Yeah, for the most part, but I'm gonna actually, what do you think the first 2 words out of my mouth are gonna be?
It depends.
It depends, right?
Test prep.
If you're,
depends, of course.
it depends, yes. I would say that if your candidacy, however you want to measure that, is solid, then I would agree. 3 months should be enough time to craft everything and work on everything. But, you know, part of, I totally agree with everything John said about the MBA Exchange as well. We try to help people reach their dreams, but we're also realistic. If you have a 650 GMAT score, a 3.0 or less GPA from maybe not the greatest college in the world, there's nothing about your work history that's superlative, you're probably, it's going to, and we never say never, but getting into an M7 school, if that's your goal, is probably going to be a little challenging, maybe even top 20. So do you have the time to address your deficiencies? GPA is already gone. You can't do anything about that, but maybe your test score, you can retake it and make it higher to help you. Maybe you can do something at work or something that you're doing in your community. You're about to get some major award in your community that you've been leading, but it hasn't quite happened. I mean, again, that's why the it depends factor, and we're very realistic with our clients. So this is, we actually have clients. I wish I'm 53, I'm telling you my age, and I don't have this kind of foresight. We have some clients that are in their early 20s that in March sign up saying that, hey, by the way, I'm not applying this coming fall, I'm applying the next fall, but I want to start working with you now.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh my God, that's like a gift, because we have so much time to do what I call candidacy shaping, do a deeper analysis, figure out where we could buttress your candidacy and start working on those things so that you'll be a stronger candidate and have all the time in the world to work on all those. I mean, we don't even talk about resume at that point. So that's why I say it depends.
Yeah, 3 months may be enough time to complete a good application and go in there and put your best foot forward, but you're not going to be shaping your story in any meaningful way.
Right.
Because you're going to be busy working on your apps and not addressing a real deficiency. Now, Alex, you were candid enough to reveal not only your GMAT score, but your age.
Yes.
And now I got to ask John, how old are you and what was your GMAT score?
So, yeah, 44 now, 45 in February, Aquarius for anyone that cares. And I had a 510, a 610, and a 580. Yeah. Now, for those out there that low scores, what I did in my optional essay is I just came clean that I don't test well, and I mean everything. My MCAT, I almost went to med school at one point. My SAT, I don't test well. I never have. And I said, you know, that's just the deal you get with me. So,
but here's what I like. You tried several attempts.
Yeah.
And it showed a couple of things. It showed how badly you wanted it.
Right.
And that's an important message to a school. I really want to go to your program. and I'm willing to do whatever I need to do it. The other thing it says about Duke, which we know in the business, is that every school says you get a holistic review. At Duke, you really get a holistic review.
Very true. Yes.
And standardized test scores are not over-indexed at Duke as they are at some other schools.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's just the truth.
Yep.
Put it out
John,
there.
I'm just laughing because
My favorite essay question is 25 things.
Yes.
Today.
oh yeah, great question.
So much fun.
And you know
learn so much about a person.
Yeah, and John, what I tell clients that this past week that are interviewing at other schools, even though I applied to few, I'm like, take a look at that list before you go into wherever, Harvard Booth, because there's some cool, fun things in there that if that question comes for that time that you were, I've seen some great ones over the years, bring those out. They're going to draw a lap. They could break the ice. Have them in the back pocket,
Yeah, it's really true. And, when Sherry Hubert went to Duke to become the head admissions director from Georgetown, she did it and shared it with everyone. It's a great document to look at if you want to sort of prototype to think, how do you do 25 things about me that you otherwise wouldn't know? And incidentally, I think it's a great icebreaker at a party. Hey, Alex, John, hey, thanks for your time. Really enjoyed it. Great advice. It was great fun to be with the both of you. I enjoyed it probably more than anyone else. And
likewise, John.
Yeah, and everyone out there, if you need some advice and help, you have two options here. You can go the Admissionado route, or you can go the MBA Exchange route. Either way, you'll be in good hands. You'll have empathetic people who really care about you, who want to create a relationship with you, not a transaction, and help you achieve your goals. Thank you, guys. This is John Burke of Poets and Quants. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone.